We're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Make sure to subscribe wherever you download your podcasts as well. Today, I'm joined by author Kenny Xu. Kenny is the author of An Inconvenient Minority, the Ivy League admissions cases, and the attack on Asian American excellence that is due out in July. You can pre-order it now. You can also follow Kenny on Twitter at Kenny M. Xu. That's XU. Kenny, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Emily. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I want to talk. So the sort of Asian American experience has been in the news a lot lately for two reasons in particular. The first is the pending litigation against Ivy League colleges for discriminating against Asian Americans. And the second reason, sadly, is the tragedy that unfolded in Atlanta with the mass shootings that left a lot of Asian women dead, unfortunately, in spas around the Atlanta area. So, Kenny, would you be able to just kind of break down for us, first of all, where that litigation against schools stands?
Sure, Emily. I mean, and thank you for having me on the show. I love The Federalist. It's great. I've written many articles for The Federalist on this specific issue. And in my book, An Inconvenient Minority, I talk about it in further detail, especially as it relates to Asian Americans and our declining culture of excellence. But what's happening at Harvard and at Ivy League universities is a race-obsessed program. I mean, Harvard and Ivy League universities, they basically invented the script on race. The first affirmative action case that upheld race in admissions in 1978, Bakke versus UC Regents, the judge who allowed the program to go through, you suggested using Harvard's race-based system as an example. Race was always ingrained into Harvard's life, into Harvard's lifeblood. The reason why is because Harvard feels like they are a center of producing the next world leaders. And of course, since the world is so representative of, between races and everything like that, Harvard feels the need, they feel guilty, and they feel the need to craft a body of certain racial components to it. That's ignoring things like the individual merit of an applicant, whether a person is qualified to handle the work. They've created the entire framework of society that they want based on their own racial balancing standards. And Asian Americans are not part of this framework. At least they're part of this framework up to a very limited extent. To the extent that Asian Americans overachieve in America, Harvard University and these Ivy League universities think it's a problem. They don't want their student body to be 40% Asian, even though Harvard's own internal documents suggest that. If merit-based admissions was the lead admissions process in these colleges, Asian Americans would make up about 40% of the student body. They don't want their admissions to be like that because it would look bad and it would not fit in with their racial balancing agenda.
Can you talk to me about how this litigation and the problem in general has galvanized people in the Asian American community? I mean, has it really left a bitter taste against the left or against, maybe these institutions of American excellence, as your subtitle says, or American eliteness? Has it left a bitter taste in their mouth? And is there really a big effort to organize among Asian Americans against attempted discrimination from these schools?
Yeah, so among Asian Americans, there are several reactions. First, some Asian Americans have accepted it. They have said, okay, Harvard discriminates against us. That just means we have to work twice as hard to get to where we want, in the Ivy League process. That is one reaction that some Asian Americans have taken. Other Asian Americans have internalized this. They have said things, and in my book, An Inconvenient Minority, I interview a lot of these people who have said these exact things. Harvard, Asian Americans they've said things like Asian Americans are a privileged group. We are anti-Black. In a sense that we deserve this discrimination if we are to raise the prospects of other racial minorities. And so they've internalized this discrimination, and they've been taught to feel guilty about their success in education. They've been taught to feel guilty about their academic excellence. That is another reaction. But the third reaction I feel is the correct one, which is to advocate boldly, to stand up for your own rights, to be treated on the basis of the content of your character, not the color of your skin. The reason why I believe that this is the correct approach is because it's the most American approach. This is a lot of ordinary Asian Americans have risen up. In fact, some of the lead lawsuits of Harvard University and of racial preferences laws in the nation are Chinese Americans and Asian Americans. They've really come and they've stood up and they said, hey, don't discriminate against me for things that I can't change about myself, for things that I don't want to change about myself. The fact that I'm a color of the skin or my name sounds like Shu or Yang should not disqualify me or should not be an inhibiting factor in my life. It should be dependent upon my work, my character, my intelligence, and my habits. And I think that the vast majority of Americans agree. So this is why a lot of Chinese Americans and Asian Americans have had a lot of success taking down racial preferences laws in places like California with Proposition 16. They just took down that law in 2020. And I think they're going to continue to have success.
Let's actually just zoom in on Proposition 16 for a moment, because it's such an interesting case study. What happened with that? I mean, I was actually even surprised as an outside observer that it turned out the way that it did. What transpired, and what do you think it says about the potential success in other battles?
Sure, I'll tell you. So this is what happened in Proposition 16. There were a group of activist lawmakers. So first of all, California has a non-discrimination law statute in its constitution that was made in the 1990s by this businessman named Ward Connerly. And he basically instituted this statute that said the state will not discriminate on the basis of race, gender, sexual orientation, that kind of thing. The state will not discriminate on the basis of characteristics like that. And that passed in a supposedly liberal state, 55%. The only issue with that law is that a group of activists didn't like it because it prevented universities from doing racial preferences. It prevented universities from being able to use race as their factor in admissions process the way they want to. And so a group of activists led by this congresswoman named Shirley Weber created this law in the middle of the pandemic. They hustled it through the very liberal supermajority in California in 2020 in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic on the second day that the legislature returned to session in March. And they hustled through this law that couched in a lot of flowery language about diversity and systematic racism and stuff like that. But the law itself, the text itself, is actually just one sentence. It's we will repeal Proposition 209, which is the anti-discrimination statute. That is the actual text of the law. And in the California system, you have to, once you get that passed, if you want to make a constitutional amendment or amend a constitutional amendment, it has to go through the ballot box. So after it got passed, everybody thought, oh, this is just going to go through. This is such a liberal state. Nobody's, they're all going to vote for this proposition, and we're going to have race in admissions. We're going to have race in public contracting. We're going to have government preferences for minority-owned businesses again, just because the head of the business and the figurehead is a minority. We're just going to go back to that system, and then that's what's going to happen until a group of Chinese Americans, Wenyan Wu, was the executive director, and I know her personally. I've interviewed her for my book, An Inconvenient Minority. She was the executive director for the No on 16 campaign. She went and she teamed up with that former businessman, Ward Connerly, brought in a ton of grassroots Chinese American support, Asian American support, rallied a whole bunch of people to the cause, did a grassroots campaign, was outspent 13-1. The other side raised $13 million, the Yes on Proposition campaign, and of course funded mostly by Silicon Valley billionaires. And they went to the ballot box with it, and they won. The No on Proposition 16 campaign won 57% to 43% in the most liberal state in America. And I think it just shows many things. One, voters and most Americans just do not want race in our system. We just don't. Why would we? We've already gone past that. We've had a phase in our history that we're not proud of. that internalize that. And we need to move past it. And I think that people are going to wake up to this. And I think that this is the start, hopefully the beginning of the end of this racial division that this country's been undergoing for the last 10 years.
Well, can you speak to the extent to which this movement that you're a part of is a bipartisan effort? So is it not just, I mean that kind of on the formal levels, the people that are behind these campaigns, they may not be open conservatives, the types of open or even like self-identified conservatives, the types of people that that have been fighting some of these issues. Or even just downstream of that, the people who support them. I mean, you mentioned in a liberal state, this proposition failed as badly as it did. So on sort of that top level, to what extent is it bipartisan, and then among the general public as well?
Sure. So in a recent poll by Pew, you can look it up, 2019 poll by Pew, 3 out of 4 Americans, 75%, of Americans said that they do not approve of the use of race in college admissions. They actually want college admissions to be a merit-based process. That's 75% of the public that was polled in a Pew Research survey said they do not want race in college admissions. The Proposition 16 fight underscored that. They do not want race in state contracts, in state employment. They do not want racial preferences in public employment. Winning that 57% to 43%. I mean, obviously, most Republicans do not want this, but it seems to me, by the numbers that you see this, a very large number of independents don't want this either. And then, even among Democrats, the issue with the Democratic Party right now with regards to this issue is that there is a very vocal segment of race peddlers who have gained their careers on the backs of race, on the backs of identity politics, dividing people on the basis of race. Take a look at Stacey Abrams. In Georgia, one of, I think, everybody's clearest examples of, and give her credit for this, she rallied the Black community on the basis of Black identity politics. Identity politics is still a phenomenon in our culture that has a lot of political swell, and it has a lot of political sway, has a lot of money behind it. People still fund based on these things. Academics still get grants to write social justice articles based upon well-intentioned donors who think, oh, we're just funding diversity. No, you're not funding diversity. You're funding race ideology. You're funding the re-internalization of race in our culture, but people haven't woken up to that yet. So as a result, you have these people in our culture on the left who are really for this kind of thing, and that's what's pushing the Democratic Party in this direction.
Do you see this changing? Do you see the admissions process changing at all in the near future?
I think a lot of it's going to be as a result of the outcome of this Harvard lawsuit. I mean, this is why I wrote the book. I mean, in an Inconvenient Minority, people have been fighting race preferences or race balancing in our society for a while, but haven't gained much ground because people have been able to paint the opponents of these actions as either white supremacists or selfish or people who don't care about minorities and those kinds of things. But this lawsuit I think is different because this lawsuit, it's a group of minorities, Asian Americans, who in many ways have faced historical discrimination in our society. The Asian Americans who were excluded from the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1800s, the Japanese Americans who were interned, during the FDR administration in the 40s, during World War II. Asian Americans have faced racism. We face discrimination. We've been victims of violence, and so, but in the admission system now and in the college admission system, they do not care about that narrative about us at all. They prefer to pit minority against minority to achieve their desired outcome. And I think that the Supreme Court has to take a big nod to that.
Can you talk about, and this is a sort of transition to our next topic, can you talk about the incoherence on the left's position towards identity politics when it comes to the way they approach, let's say, racial preferences and affirmative action in college admissions, but then at the same time turn around and talk about kind of the rampant anti-Asian violence and discrimination in the wake of that tragic mass shooting earlier this month?
Sure. So first of all, the violence. Even in the violence, there is a narrative, right? I mean, the narrative among the mainstream media during the Atlanta shootings was that it was a white supremacist attack. They were trying to find in some way. I have a subscription to the Washington Post. You could not see more articles about Asian Americans during the day after that day and how much racism they faced in this and that and everything like that. But I mean, the key is really that that narrative in itself is just a false narrative. It's a false narrative because if you look at the actual data in 2018, Asian Americans have faced violence. The perpetrators of anti-Asian violence, 28% Black, 25% white, everyone else other races. So it wasn't even white people who are committing the majority or even the plurality of these attacks against Asian Americans. So why are we blaming white supremacy about this? So first of all, the facts of that violent cases aren't even correct. Second of all, it's selective facts. It's selective facts because on one hand, you're trying to fight, you claim that you're fighting anti-Asian racism, you're standing up for Asian Americans, but literally when it comes to Asian Americans who choose to achieve, who choose to invest in their educational excellence, who, the average Asian American studies twice as many hours per week as the average white person, as the average American, And when it comes to actually standing up for their right to be treated like an American, which is to say on the content of their character, these people are completely silent. They do not want to talk about this. Why? Because their friends are supportive of this kind of thing. So it just reveals to me a deep hypocrisy in the way that Asian Americans are treated and used in the media narrative today.
What does that tell us about the left's broader approach or the left's broader argument about race? Because there's a very explicit claim embedded in the argumentation about, say, cultural appropriation or racism, that it can only be racism if it's being perpetrated by the majority against the minority or by the oppressor against the oppressed. And when you take the case of Asian Americans, they are not a majority. So what does this tell us? Is there, something that are they the case study that shows the left's argument about what they claim to believe when it comes to racial discrimination and oppression is ultimately incoherent or insincere?
This is why I entitled my book An Inconvenient Minority, because Asian Americans inconvenience the narratives, the race narratives on the left, because the narrative that is being pushed today is that if you are a minority or a person of color, you are a victim of white supremacy, right? And if you are white, you are privileged, you are an oppressor against these people, or at the very least, you're suffering from you are participating in, or you are sublimating in the effects of that. Asian Americans completely challenge and disprove this narrative because Asian Americans are a minority. We have been historically discriminated in this society. And, we lack the privileges that a lot of people in America have. A lot of us are first-gen immigrants. We come here with no money. And we're disproportionately reliant upon our skills and our merit to succeed. But guess what? We do. The average income of Asian Americans is higher than the average white income. Asian Americans tend to get higher grades, higher test scores, better educational outcomes, lower rates of crime than other racial minority groups. And we're able to be successful in this country because this country is not ultimately a racist, oppressive country. It's a country where in a meritocracy, you can succeed in this country, regardless of your race. And Asian Americans put a huge wrench in this race narrative that says if you're a person of color, you're a victim. And I think that's an important message that we really, really have to get out there, especially in today's culture.
I mean, speaking of something that's inconvenient, the sort of truth behind what happened in Atlanta and the narrative the media sort of immediately jumped to, the reality, inconveniently for the media's narrative, was out of touch with what they had immediately started spinning. I wonder, first of all, if you agree with that, because what it turns out is that the police immediately were saying, listen, we can't rule out that there was some sort of hate crime perpetrated in Atlanta. But at the same time, the shooter says he was motivated by, something, again, I'm paraphrasing, to having to do with a sex addiction or going to those spas for a sex addiction, and taking out his anger at his own lack of self-control on the spas. First of all, did you see the same disconnect between the reality and the narrative that immediately emerged and was pushed all over, as you say, top outlets like the Washington Post? And secondly, what was your reaction to that narrative as it emerged, again, like immediately after this unfolded?
Was there a disconnect? I was offended. I mean, I'm not, I was offended by how consumed they were by the race story, because there was actually a story here. Like, there are actually multiple stories in this particular attack. For example, human exploitation of massage parlors. Potentially, there's undercurrents. Sex trafficking in this country is a big thing. Also, the person's mental health, sexual addiction. That's a huge thing right now, especially among young men. There's so many actually substantiated, interesting narratives that you could point out about this. There are actually stories that matter, that if you actually put 1 ounce of effort into this, but instead you go with a white supremacist against Asian narrative that is entirely fact-free. And I've already explained, there's no evidence to suggest that white supremacy is the cause of violence against Asian Americans. And furthermore, there's not even enough evidence in this case to suggest that is the case. I mean, going with this narrative about Asian Americans, I see a concerted effort to try to turn Asian Americans into victims, into a victim group. There is an attempt to turn Asian Americans into a victim group today. I think that is what is being said, while, of course, you allow the elites to continue actually victimizing Asian Americans with their racial balancing systems.
No, I saw. Oh, keep going, Kenny. Keep going.
No, you go.
Well, I was going to say, I saw a lot of Asian American journalists or people in the media class responding by kind of embracing the narrative that there is systematic discrimination against Asian Americans. How do you think that might be catching on with the Asian American community? Is that something that's increasingly popular as people, and this happens, with everyone who goes through our system of higher education, as you know very well, are sort of becoming more and more progressive and more prone to embracing narratives like that? I mean, do you think that's something that's happening, or do you think that's something that's isolated to kind of blue check elites on Twitter?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think this is really, really creeping in, especially to my generation. When I was in, the whole victim mentality is a huge thing in higher education right now. There's a lot of money that's being attached to it. And there's a lot of social currency in playing a victim as well, especially in the education system. Because when you're a victim, you get access, again, like I said, if you play a victim group, you get access to unmerited privileges. I mean, that's the number one thing that being a victim group allows you to do. You gain access to sympathy that you do not necessarily deserve. And in colleges and higher education, I mean, I had a personal experience with this. My freshman year of college, when I went to Davidson, There was a diversity training seminar there that basically said, okay, here is a hierarchy of races. The whites are at the top, blacks are at the bottom, Asians are kind of in the middle, along with Jews. And that's what it was. They just subdivided you into groups, and they literally said you're at the top of the totem pole because you're here, and you're at the bottom of the totem pole because you're here. And I was just thinking to myself, don't we all go to Davidson College? Like, aren't we all super privileged to the fact that we like live in America and are going to college and are in this system? Like, why are we dividing people right now? But the truth is, they're doing this before college too. They're doing this in elementary school. There's several articles about this in City Journal and everything like that. But California's ethnic studies curriculum basically subdivides people into races, and they teach third graders to basically walk forward. There's this little playtime that they have, but they teach third graders to basically walk forward if they're white and to walk backwards if they're black. And these are like walks of shame that they're doing based on characteristics that you literally cannot control. And they're doing this in third grade, and it's hurting our country. It's getting into a mentality, and I think it's destroying lives.
That is bleak, but I also have to wonder if the patterns that you describe and that you've described here and that you describe in An Inconvenient Minority, if you think that kind of does chip away at any of the control the left may have been able to sort of build with Asian Americans, or the influence or appeal that the left may be building with Asian Americans, particularly through our system of higher education. I wonder if you think the discrimination the left also supports in college admissions maybe chips away at that at all.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. It's odd. This just reveals the logical incoherency of the narrative, because Asians are considered a privileged group when it comes to things like education, when it comes to things like admissions. Harvard treats Asians as a privileged group, even more privileged than whites. Harvard's standards for discriminating against Asians are even more stringent than they are with whites. I mean, whites are discriminated in the admissions process too, don't get me wrong, but Asians are further discriminated even in comparison to whites. Based on Harvard's use of the personality score, which is entirely subjective and not reliant upon any objective evidence. In fact, the objective evidence suggests that Asian Americans actually perform just as well as whites in alumni interviews and teacher recommendations. And yet they use this personality score, and they put Asians at the bottom of this to discriminate against them. But Asians are considered privileged in the Harvard admission system and in educational statistics. They're lumped in with whites in racial achievement gap statistics. But now they're still trying to create a victim narrative of Asian Americans. They're still trying to get Asian Americans the fervor and the zeitgeist of being part of this minority person of color narrative for the purposes of creating a person of color versus white solidarity that they're trying to do. But as you can see the inherent tension in this, because they're already trying to pigeonhole Asians with whites. Now they're trying to call us victims and be with people of color too. It just completely puts a screw in their entire narrative. It is an inconvenient minority.
Now, Kenny, you were on Tucker Carlson's Fox News show just last week to talk about this, but also to talk about China. Can you tell us a little bit about the conversation you had on air with Tucker as it pertains to
Chucker?
Chucker, yeah.
Yeah. Chucker was Tucker was great. He wanted to know. Tucker is very passionate about China. And China, I mean, I think we all need to be pretty passionate about China, because on one hand, China is, responsible for a lot of human rights abuses. They're responsible for, a lot of authoritarian control of their country and everything like that. But on the other hand, China is laughing at us because we are shooting ourselves in the foot with our culture of excellence, buying into all this woke stuff, admitting people who are less qualified over people who are more qualified, setting racial quotas that eliminate the principle of merit, because now we're going to judge you on your background, not whether you're the most qualified candidate. We're going to prefer you if you are a certain race. And it's killing our culture of excellence. It really is. And it's not incentivizing people to work hard. And all the while, here comes China. And they are already competing with us in tech supremacy in the world, in cybersecurity, in medicine, and everything like that, in bioweapons and everything like that. China has a culture of excellence right now that they are engineering, and they're laughing at us because while they're doing that, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And so that's what I got to talk to Tucker about, because Tucker was very interested in, well, what happens when we destroy a culture of excellence. And then I brought up the Cultural Revolution in China, because during the Cultural Revolution, in case your viewers are not familiar, in 1966, Mao Zedong launches the Cultural Revolution in China. Mao Zedong, under the Communist Party control. During the Cultural Revolution, he expelled intellectuals. He considered them part of the bourgeoisie. He expelled people who were considered capitalists. He expelled landowners. He hated intellectuals. He convened struggle sessions whereby people would actually turn against their own parents and accuse them of being nationalist or anti-Maoist sympathizers. And then they would torture them and beat them and enforced a culture of conformity. And what did it do to their culture of excellence? Well, it killed it. It destroyed it, because the intellectuals fled to the countryside, or they emigrated, or they were just simply killed. And it set China, such a country of billion people, it set them back in ways that they're still dealing with today. And so the damages that the culture that took us hundreds and thousands of years to build up can be killed in the span of a generation. And a lot of the Chinese immigrants who came to this country know that, and they're fighting against it.
Kenny, these are such fascinating insights, and we thank you very much for your time today.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Emily. I really appreciate being on your show.
Of course. Well, you've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at the Federalist. He's Kenny Xu. You can follow him on Twitter at Kenny M. Xu. That's Kenny MXU. You can also pre-order his book, An Inconvenient Minority, which is due out in July. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.